Hi everyone, my name is Jethro and welcome back to the Lenovo Photography Masterclass. As you recall, in our previous sessions, we have covered the basics of photo editing as well as a general workflow on Adobe Lightroom. In part 2 of this masterclass, you'll be moving towards advanced photo editing. I'll be sharing with you an in-depth look into Adobe Lightroom, and this will be followed by a few methods on how you can increase the efficiency of your editing workflow. The Lenovo Yoga Slim 7 Carbon is truly designed for creatives like me who work on the go. Super light and durable, with a battery that pretty much lasts all day, I find that it is now no sweat to bring it out with me, even on the days when I'm bogged down with all my gear. An 8-core AMD Ryzen processor and Radeon graphics card ensures speedy performance while delivering crisp, vibrant graphics displayed on a color-calibrated true black screen, meaning that not only can the laptop handle complex creative tasks, it also ensures color accuracy, which is a key aspect in my line of work. Equipped with the new Lenovo AI chip for smart machine learning and with a user-friendly Windows 11 interface, I could customize my workflow even more efficiently. The Yoga Slim 7 Carbon truly combines the best of both worlds, portability and performance, allowing me to work both anywhere and everywhere. In this session, there are 4 parts that I'll be touching on to cover an in-depth look into editing on Adobe Lightroom. In part 1, we'll be looking at the RGB point curve. In part 2, we'll be looking at split toning. And in part 3, I'll be touching on color calibration. And lastly, in part 4, we'll be looking at how masking works. Remember in the previous session, we went through how you can use the tone curve to fine-tune the shadows and highlights of a photo. So the RGB curve is an extension of that, whereby you can use the red, green, blue point curves to adjust individual color channels according to the RGB color model. It follows the exact same logic, just that in addition to affecting the tonal output, these channels also affect the color output, where here, small adjustments can go a very long way in changing the color of a photo. When you click on one of the color channels on the point curve, you can choose a tonal region in which you want to change the color balance of the photo. Alternatively, what you can do is that you can click on the middle and then drag the curve up or down to affect the color balance for the whole image in that given channel. You just need to remember the basics, which are the opposite of red is cyan, the opposite of the green curve is magenta, and lastly, the opposite of blue is yellow. So, for example, if you were to place a point curve here in the darker areas and drag it downwards like I did, what happens is that you can see that there's an increase in the cyans but a decrease in the reds for the darker areas of the curve. Now, in contrast, if you were to place a point in the lighter area and drag it upwards, you would see that there is an increase in the reds on the lighter areas, but there's a decrease in the cyans. So another thing that you can actually take note of is to set control points through the photo, like so. And then this will allow you to anchor down specific tonal regions. And this is beneficial in ensuring that these areas experience minimal changes when other regions are adjusted. So for example, when I adjust the darker region here below, just to make it maybe a bit more blue, you notice that actually the lighter regions doesn't move at all. So conversely, when I want to shift the lighter region upwards, I can add in a bit more reds without adjusting the darker blue areas here. So this is actually quite an extreme example. I would not edit it this way, but this is just an example to show you what you can do with the tone curve when it comes to adjusting the white balance of a photo. Split toning is a means of adding hints of color to the shadows, midtones, and highlights of an image. This is actually similar to changing the white balance of a photo, but you have far greater control and the results can be far more subtle and stylized. Additionally, while the RGB point curve gives you way more control and flexibility when it comes to changing the hues and the lights and darks of an image, split toning's more general adjustments means that if you need things done in a flash, it's actually the better choice. In the split toning or color grading tab, as is known now, you can see that there are 3 color wheels. These are wheels for the shadows, midtones, and highlights. Adjusting the wheels here will affect those areas respectively. So each wheel has two handles. You can drag the outer handle along the circumference to change the hues. So simply hold down Control while dragging to ensure that your saturation value does not change. As you can see, it remains at 0. So maybe I would want to have a blue tone shadows. So I'll shift it here. Next, you can drag the central handle to change the saturation of the hue you wish to add. So since I've chosen a blue, I would like to lock that down. So you press Shift while dragging to lock it down. So now I will increase the hue. You can see that as I drag the slider towards the circumference of the circle, the shadows get bluer and bluer. Next is the luminance. The luminance is a slider that controls the brightness of the color introduced. So in this case, since I've introduced a bit of blue into the shadows, I can play around with how bright the hue, this blue hue would be. So if I drag the luminance slider to the left, you can see that the shadows are now a lot darker because I've reduced the black point of the shadow. Conversely, if I shift it to the right, it increases the white point of the shadows, and now the picture appears a lot brighter. This is the same effect if I were to shift the luminance slider for the highlights and the midtones. So let me show it to you. So if I would like to have a brighter, more orangey sky, we can do that by first shifting this here to have an orange highlight, and then dragging the slider up so that I can create a more orangey highlight over here. And then maybe I would like the orange highlight to be a bit brighter so the photo is more faded out. So I will shift the luminance slider to the right, and then maybe again I'll adjust the shadows so that it's a bit darker. Now, moving on to the blending slider. The blending slider is universal across the split toning wheels. This determines how much color the shadows, highlights, and midtones interact. So you can see that if I shift it to 0, there is actually no overlap. But at 100, all three regions overlap fully and can create much more smoother color transitions. Now, lastly is the balance slider. This is also universal across the split toning wheels. Dragging the balance slider to the left tells Lightroom to treat the image as more shadows, while dragging it to the right treats more of the image as highlights. This allows for final control over the intensity of the color grading on the shadows and highlights. So in this case, maybe I feel that there's a bit too much blue in the darker area. So for the balance, I would shift it more to the right so that highlights will play a larger role. Given the complexity of how all the hues and saturations can actually overlap, it's often best to keep things simple when it comes to split toning and color grading. Fortunately, the best color grading techniques are just that, simple and effective, rather than going over the top. So much like the RGB curves, a little adjustment here can go a very long way. For example, like what we did earlier, you can try adding orange and blue tints to your shadows and highlights. It's kind of cliche, but it works to create something much more cinematic and dynamic than if you did not do it at all. Alternatively, this is another trick that you can do with your split toning. So if you take a black and white photo, you can actually tint your photo with a bit of color as well to better set a mood. So maybe what I would suggest is some dark blue shadows here to make the photo a little more cold and brutal. So you can see I've chosen my hue. Now I'm going to increase the saturation. You can see that now the photo has this really nice blue tint to it. Alternatively, another thing you can do is that you can actually give some orange and red to emulate a more vintage, warm film look. So you can see over here when I increase the color, there's a more warmer tone to the photo. So this is one way that you can do to actually give your black and white images some style. Okay. Many actually misunderstand what this tool is. Something that is similar to the temperature and tint sliders. It's not. Calibration in this context actually refers to camera calibration. And before we actually even think about calibrating the colors of your image, we need to talk about color science first. Every pixel has a varied mix of red, green, and blue. So what makes a shade of blue, blue? It would actually be this mix of colored pixels, and this is one facet of color science. In this case, color science refers to the manufacturer's interpretation of color, and every manufacturer will have a different recipe per se when it comes to creating a specific shade. Now, have you ever wondered why some people say things like, oh, Canon produces photos with better skin tones, or Sony produces colors that are more accurate. What they actually mean is that they prefer that Canon places more emphasis on red in your pixels, or that they have a preference for Sony's more balanced combination of reds, greens, and blues. This tool would allow you to change the makeup of the reds, greens, and blues in pixels so as to create a color that better suits the theme that you are going for. Through these adjustments, you will be able to emulate the color science of a Canon photo taken with a Sony or Nikon camera. Alternatively, you can use calibration to create your own distinct look to your photos. To better visualize what we have just talked about when it comes to color science, I have a color wheel here where we can better see how the changes made in calibration would affect the colors of a photo. So here, these three sliders, changing the primary sliders here would cause a global change across all colors that contain the said pigment. So for example, if we slide the hue of the red primary slider to the right, this changes all reds to oranges. And because every single color, or almost every single color, contains some measure of red, all those colors with a bit of red in it will be affected to a certain degree. Conversely, if I were to shift the hue of the red to magenta, you can see that every single color that contained the hue red was affected as well. So this is the same case when it comes to the greens, for green, and for blue as well. As a result, camera calibration can be used to make major stylistic changes in your photos. For example, let's take a look at this photo here. You can see all these shades, various shades of greens, right? I feel that I would like them to be more orange to evoke a sense of autumn. So to do this, I would shift the blue primary all the way to the left. Now you can see that all the leaves are orange, but the problem is this also affects the blue hues. I have turned all the blue colored hues of the monk's robes into teal. So this doesn't feel very natural. So what you can do to alleviate this is go back up to the saturation tab, and then you can lower the blue, you can lower the teal saturation so that it doesn't stand out so much, and then you fix the hue. You shift the blue closer towards purple so that the color is now a little more natural per se. So this is one example that you can do when it comes to split toning. So masks are layers that you can add to provide selective adjustment to localize areas of a photo. Select this tool over here to go to your masking. Now in this image, you can see that there are already two masks on it. Each black circle here indicates a selective adjustment. When you click on one of these circles, they will turn gray, meaning that now you are adjusting this specific mask. So a mask is indicated by a red highlight around its selection area. You can either show its selection area by hovering over the black dot, or you can select Show Overlay in the checkbox over here. This reveals the extent of your masking layer. Now, as you can see here, when I select Create New Mask, there are three different types of masks: brushes, linear gradients, and radial gradients. Let's take a look at the linear gradients first. Linear gradients apply adjustments in a linear fashion. This is how you apply such a mask. Select on it, and then all you need to do is just drag across the area that you wish. Now you can see that based on a Show Overlay, you can show how hard the gradient is. The distance between the inner line and the outer line determines the gradient's intensity. By clicking and dragging on the outer lines like so, you are able to choose how soft or hard the edge of your gradient will be. Additionally, you can rotate the overlay by clicking on the middle line and then dragging it around. So as you can see now, the overlay actually covers the bottom half of the image rather than the top half. So one way of using linear gradients is actually to add a bit of light or mist to the sky if they are minor changes that you are able to get away with without even using Photoshop at all. So this is what you can do. In this case here, you can notice that the sky is actually rather inert. So I feel that adding a bit of light would help tremendously. So now that I've added in my linear gradient to around here like so, just on the sky portion, you can play around with the exposures, the highlights, and even the dehaze function to create a more misty effect. So in this case, what I would do is I would increase the exposure just a little bit like so. I would lower the dehaze so that there's a more misty effect, and I will also increase the highlights so that the bit of sunlight here is lighter. In fact, another thing I can do is lower the clarity and texture so that the tree branches here all look a little bit more misty. And lastly, to create the feel of a bit of golden light in the morning, I'll just increase the temperature just by a little bit so that just the portion of the sky is warm while the rest of the scenery is still blue and green. Next, let's talk about radial gradients. So radial gradients apply adjustments in a radial fashion where the filter is the strongest in the center and it slowly radiates outwards and slowly loses its intensity. So this is how you add a radial filter. Simply click on it and then just drag and draw a circle like so. So you can see here that there's a feather slider. The feather slider dictates how soft the transition is between the center of the radial filter and the outer edge. At 100, you can see that there's an obvious gradient between what is unmasked towards, and it slowly increases intensity towards the center. If I were to bring the feather to 0, you can see that there's now no transition whatsoever. It's the filter stays the same whether is it in the center or at the edge. Additionally, another thing you can do is invert the filter. If you check this box like so, the effects on the mask now affects everything on the outside of the circle as opposed to the inside. One way you can use a radial filter is to brighten up a subject without causing too much contrast. So in this case, my subject is this guy over here. He's wreathed in shadow, so I feel he's a bit too dark. That way, now I will place a filter over him and adjust the filter accordingly such that it only covers him, like a general area around him, so that when we do the adjustments, the surroundings will not be affected. Additionally, make sure that your transition is soft with the feather slider to really make sure that only his body, which is in the center of the filter, is most affected by the changes made to the mask. So now that you have applied the radial filter, you can play around the exposure, the highlights, and the shadows. In this case, I'll increase the exposure just a little bit so that he appears brighter. And then I'll increase the shadows and the highlights so that he stands out a bit more. And once you're okay with the changes, just select done. So while yes, you can use an adjustment brush, which we'll cover in a moment, the radial filter is actually great if you need to cover a general area. It's much faster. Finally, let's move on to the adjustment brush. The adjustment brush is a highly versatile tool as it allows you the freedom to create a mask over very specific areas without being restricted to a specific gradient. And because of this, the adjustment brush has quite a number of sliders where you can customize how would you like your brush to be. First, let's take a look at the size slider. The size slider changes the overall size of the adjustment brush. You can also scroll on your mouse to change this. Next is the feather slider. This affects how soft or hard the edges of your brush will be. So for more blended adjustment, use a larger feather radius. Next is flow. Flow changes how your brush is applied to a photo. Similar to pressing harder or lighter on a piece of paper with a pencil, flow changes how strong your adjustments are applied. And lastly, with density, it's much like opacity. With a less dense brush, all your adjustments will have much less of an effect. One trick I like to use with the adjustment brush is to do a quick retouch of the faces of people in my photos. While yes, the proper way would be to use Photoshop to ensure greater quality control, Lightroom works very well in a pinch. So what you see here is a photo of myself, and what I will do is first I'll select the adjustment brush over here and then make sure that the show overlay is turned on and then carefully brush over the face. You have to be careful to avoid facial features such as the eyes, lips, and nostrils, basically features that need to stay defined. And of course, you should take your time to get the brushing done. The more meticulous you are with it, the better your results would be. So now that I'm happy with my masking, what I'll do is I will lower the texture, lower the clarity, and I will also lower the sharpness. So I usually lower it by just a little, never more than -20 to give the skin a smoother texture. And because this works by reducing detail, it's really important that you avoid any area that you want to stay defined with. Now, let's do a recap on what we have learned so far. In part 1, we covered how the RGB curve is an extension of tone curve in that it allows you to adjust the highlights and shadows of individual red, green, and blue color channels. Next, we learned that split toning is similar to adjusting the white balance of a photo, but with much greater control. allowing for changes that are far more subtle and stylized. We then learned that color calibration may be similar to adjusting the temperature and tint of a photo, but it actually refers to adjusting the color combinations of red, green, and blue pixels, thereby allowing you to manipulate a photo's color makeup so as to emulate or create a distinct color profile. And lastly, we now know how to make isolated adjustments to a photo through the various masks and adjustment brushes available on Lightroom. So let's take a break here, and when we come back, I'll teach you how to be more efficient with your editing workflow. I'll see you then.